This changes everything. Budanov has revealed for the first time when the war might end. Putin definitely did not expect this. Russia will no longer win. Bloomberg has made a sensational statement. The head of the presidential office confirmed the main point. This blow is stronger than sanctions. Trump is launching a missile project for Ukraine. Putin miscalculated. NATO and the US have made a decision that breaks the Kremlin's plans. Budanov said this out loud for the first time. The war is entering a decisive phase. I'll tell you all the details in just a moment. Greetings. This is Ukraine Today, Victoria Perepelitsa, and the latest events. Urgently, Budanov has revealed the scenario millions have been waiting for, and for the first time, the head of the presidential office has spoken about possible timelines for the end of the active phase of the war. Could this moment come before the end of the year?
There is a chance, and in the spring, negotiations were progressing at a very good pace. Now we've all moved into escalation. Everyone understands this. In order to get out of escalation, it usually requires the maximization of escalation.
However, Budanov warned, before the resolution comes, the level of escalation could reach its peak. These very words are now being discussed by experts all over the world.
Escalation now, de-escalation, and then the continuation of dialogue, if both sides are interested in it.
An unexpected signal from Budanov? For the first time, there was an answer to the main question of recent months. Could the Kremlin itself become interested in ending the war? The head of the presidential office's answer was brief, but it made many people think.
I think that at a certain point in time, yes.
Budanov's loud statement shattered one of the most discussed myths surrounding the negotiations. The head of the presidential office explained whether the allies are really pushing Ukraine to end the war. Budanov noted that the window of opportunity is connected, among other things, to the US elections in November, but it is not the main factor, although it is quite significant. Speaking about possible pressure from the allies regarding ending the war, the head of the presidential office emphasized that there is none.
I don't feel it. I don't see any pressure on us.
Moreover, what Bloomberg published could be a real wake-up call for the Kremlin. The publication concluded, Russia still holds the occupied territories, but is no longer capable of achieving victory.
Its latest offensive has stalled. The army is suffering catastrophic human losses. According to sources, more than 1.4 million people have died so far.
While Russia frantically puts out fires at oil depots, tries to save its last fuel reserves, and struggles to keep its own rear under control, Ukraine is launching a completely different process, a rapid strengthening of its army. The Kremlin is sinking deeper into crisis, and Western analysts are already openly talking about a turning point. Bloomberg describes the situation in a very telling way.
Although Ukraine is under severe stress, the growing scale and productivity of its domestic military industry, along with European funding and American weaponry, have strengthened its defense capabilities.
But the most dangerous part, analysts warn, is still ahead. A cornered Kremlin may resort to desperate measures, from a new round of nuclear blackmail to dangerously testing NATO's resolve. That is why, according to the West, there is no more time to delay. Bloomberg explains directly what needs to happen right now.
That is why Europe and the US must act now to limit Russia's capabilities and strengthen Ukraine's resilience. For this, both the stick and the carrot are needed.
There should be more anti-aircraft missile systems and long-range munitions for Ukraine, as well as stricter enforcement of sanctions and long-term military support from European allies.
The country's request for a license to produce its own Patriot interceptors deserves consideration.
The NATO summit brought Ukraine a true technological breakthrough. While Moscow was hoping that the West would eventually reduce arms supplies, a statement was made that could turn the entire situation around. Donald Trump announced a move that could turn Ukraine into a producer of missiles for one of the most powerful air defense systems in the world.
We are going to give them a license to produce Patriot missiles. Cool, right? That way, you won't be able to complain that we're not giving them enough. Make them yourselves. We'll show you how to make them. It's actually quite complicated, but you'll figure it out quickly.
The Kremlin clearly would not want to hear exactly this kind of message. Bloomberg writes, the time for Moscow to dictate its own terms is running out. The West is offering a completely different formula. First pressure, then only limited concessions, and exclusively in exchange for real steps from Russia. And here is the conclusion analysts are drawing.
A complete peace may not be possible in the near future, but a ceasefire is looking increasingly achievable. Western pressure now should help convince Putin that this is the least bad of the remaining options.
The statement by Kirilo Budanov about real chances to end hostilities as early as this year has caused a wide public response. Even Western analysts are increasingly hinting openly Moscow's strategy is beginning to show serious cracks. Why is Ukraine betting on strikes against logistics? How is domestic production of long-range weapons changing the rules of the game? And why do even reputable global publications no longer believe in a Russian victory? Let's break it down right now. Has the war really started moving toward its conclusion? Kirill Budanov's statement has sparked discussions about something that until recently seemed unattainable. There's a real chance that the war could end as early as this year. According to the head of the president's office, such chances do exist. And although the world is currently witnessing a new round of escalation, it is precisely this escalation that could lay the groundwork for future de-escalation and a return to negotiations. It sounds paradoxical, but the history of wars has repeatedly proven very often the sides begin to seek compromises only after they realize that achieving their goals by force is impossible. And it seems that Kyiv understands this logic very well. While the Kremlin continues to speak in the language of ultimatums, Ukraine is ramping up what is increasingly being called its main trump card, its own production of long-range strike weapons. Budanov openly admitted, the scale of Ukrainian production has already reached a level that allows for a significant increase in the intensity of strikes on Russian territory. This means that for Moscow, the war is becoming increasingly costly not only at the front, but also deep in the rear.
The volume of our own production has already become, let's say, respectable, which allows us to increase the intensity, and increased intensity makes it possible to achieve certain results.
It is precisely here that the scenario begins to take shape, the one that military analysts are talking about more and more often. While the Russian army is trying to advance, Ukraine is striking at what no army in the world can function without: logistics. Warehouses, supply routes, fuel infrastructure, transportation hubs. The objective is simple: to make supplying the front so complicated and expensive that every new offensive turns into an exhausting gamble for the Kremlin. The very factors that Moscow considered secondary just yesterday may today determine the outcome of the war. While Russian propaganda counts square kilometers on the map, the Ukrainian strategy is increasingly focused on depleting the enemy's resources. And if this trend continues, the moment when the Kremlin itself is forced to seriously consider dialogue may come much sooner than many expect. That is why the main question now is, what will become the real path to peace? Kyiv makes it clear, not through concessions and not by freezing the problem, but by creating conditions under which continuing the war becomes too costly and futile for Russia. If Budanov's assessments prove correct, then the first real outlines of a future peace may appear precisely after the Kremlin finally realizes that time is no longer on its side. The inevitability of Russia's defeat is being discussed even outside Ukraine. The influential Western publication Bloomberg essentially acknowledges that the prospect of Russia winning the war against Ukraine no longer seems realistic. And this is no longer the assessment of Ukrainian officials or military experts from Kyiv. Such signals are increasingly coming from leading global analytical centers where they closely monitor developments at the front and the state of the Russian economy. Just a few years ago, the Kremlin was counting on a completely different scenario. But today, even Western observers are noting that Russia's last major offensive has essentially stalled. And the cost of every new kilometer of the front for Moscow continues to rise rapidly. Human losses, production problems, labor shortages, and mounting pressure on the economy are creating a situation for the Kremlin that is becoming increasingly difficult to conceal, even behind the loudest propaganda slogans. Moreover, Ukrainian drones and missiles are increasingly reaching oil refineries, energy hubs, logistics centers, and military facilities inside Russia itself. What was once considered an inviolable rear is gradually turning into a territory of constant risks. According to many analysts, this is precisely what makes continuing the war much more costly for the Kremlin than before. Around the world, the conversation is increasingly not about whether Russia can win, but about how and when it will be forced to agree to a cessation of hostilities. Such a shift in rhetoric speaks volumes. Whereas previously discussions revolved around the possible success of the Russian offensive, now increasing attention is being paid to scenarios for a truce and finding a way out of the war. Moreover, in the West, there is now open discussion not only about new aid packages for Ukraine, but also about long-term solutions that could ultimately change the balance of power. Among these are strengthening sanctions, increasing the supply of long-range weapons, new air defense systems, and even the possibility of producing certain defense systems directly in Ukraine. In other words, partners are increasingly preparing not for a compromise on the Kremlin's terms, but for a scenario in which Russia will have to accept new rules of the game. The outlook for Moscow appears extremely unpleasant. The war, which the Kremlin had planned to finish in a matter of days, has gradually turned into a grueling conflict where time, resources, and international support are not working in Russia's favor. That is why more and more experts around the world are hinting the moment when the Kremlin's defeat becomes obvious to everyone may be much closer than it seems today. And for Russia, this means only one thing: its room for maneuver continues to shrink rapidly. The geography of the war is changing rapidly for Russia. Zelensky is already talking about a scenario that makes Moscow nervous: 1,000 drones in the sky over the Russian capital. Meanwhile, air raid alerts are reaching Siberia for the first time, and the largest oil refineries are coming under attack one after another. Why are even regions thousands of kilometers from the front beginning to feel the breath of war? How is Ukraine methodically striking at Russia's fuel and logistics system? And why is the map of a safe Russia literally falling apart before our eyes? Stay tuned.
1,000 drones over Moscow is a death sentence for the Russian Federation. Volodymyr Zelensky has voiced a scenario that the Kremlin would prefer never to discuss. According to the president of Ukraine, the moment of truth for Putin will come when massive drone attacks stop being isolated incidents and become a new reality for the Russian capital. Zelensky is convinced that the decisive factor will be not only the military, but also the psychological effect. When not just hundreds, but thousands of drones start appearing over Moscow at the same time, the Kremlin will have to view the war not through officials' reports, but through their own windows. And then Putin's inner circle will begin advising him to find a quieter place to work somewhere far beyond the Urals. And here an uncomfortable question arises for the Russian authorities. If the special operation is going according to plan, then why do they have to think more and more not about new offensives, but about evacuating key facilities and defending their own capital? It seems that the war, which the Kremlin planned to keep as far away from ordinary Russians as possible, is gradually coming back home. And the farther from Putin, from Moscow, the closer, according to Kyiv's assessment, the moment when the dictator will have to reconsider his entire strategy for this war. Meanwhile, Russia is burning farther and farther from the front line. The Novosibirsk region, a region that for years in Russia was considered almost unreachable by the war, has for the first time declared an air raid alert due to the threat of drone attacks. Such a warning has become an alarming signal for the Russian security system. After all, not long ago, residents of Siberia were told that the fighting was happening somewhere very far away. But now the word alert is being heard more and more often, even thousands of kilometers from the front. Novosibirsk is not just a major city, it is one of the main industrial centers of Russia, where hundreds of enterprises in the defense, aviation, engineering, and energy sectors are concentrated. It is here that the Chkalov aviation plant operates, which participates in the production of Su-34 Frontline bombers, as well as dozens of other strategically important enterprises, without which the Russian military-industrial complex feels quite uncomfortable. The geography of alerts in Russia continues to expand rapidly. If previously the Kremlin assured citizens that the danger only affected border regions, now even Siberian regions have to consider that distance no longer guarantees safety. And this is exactly the scenario that has been increasingly discussed in Kyiv lately. The war is gradually reaching places where no one expected to see it. Meanwhile, as Russian officials report on successfully repelling attacks, Ukraine continues its campaign against the oil infrastructure of the aggressor country, step by step. In recent months, 9 out of Russia's 10 largest oil refineries have already come under attack. The strike on the Omsk oil refinery, the largest oil processing facility in Russia, caused particular resonance. It is more than 2,500 kilometers from the Ukrainian border to the refinery. This means that the drones covered a distance that, until recently, seemed fantastical even to many military experts. If people in the Urals once felt absolutely safe, now the very geography of the war for Russia is visibly changing. The Omsk oil refinery was considered one of the key elements of Russia's fuel system. It was precisely this refinery that was expected to help mitigate the consequences of the fuel crisis, which is becoming increasingly apparent after a series of attacks on the oil refining industry. In addition, the facility is critically important for further oil processing and for ensuring the operation of other production chains. It is also symbolic that until recently, the Omsk refinery remained one of the few major oil refineries in Russia that had never suffered any damage. Now that list has become even shorter. And while officials in Moscow are trying to explain why air raid sirens are sounding even beyond the Urals, good old Belgorod has also come under attack. Drones struck the Belgorod Linear Production Directorate of main gas pipelines, as well as other infrastructure facilities in the region. The strikes also targeted Belgorod International Airport and energy facilities. And although Russian authorities traditionally try to downplay the significance of such events, the trend itself is quite telling. Not only military targets are coming under increasing pressure, but also the hubs that ensure the functioning of logistics, energy, and the transport system in the border regions. Belgorod has long ceased to be a safe rear area for the Kremlin. What was once considered a reliable staging ground for supporting Russian troops has now turned into a territory of constant tension. Air raid alerts, the operation of air defense systems, and restrictions on infrastructure operations. All of this is becoming the new everyday reality for the region. And while Russian propaganda continues to paint a picture of an absolutely protected Russia, the map itself seems to be changing right before our eyes. From Belgorod to Omsk, more and more important facilities are being forced to think not about development and modernization, but about their own survival. And this is already a completely different reality from the one the Kremlin promised its citizens at the start of the war.
While the Kremlin draws victories on paper, reality is turning into a real nightmare for Moscow. Ukrainian forces are reclaiming territory, Russian logistics are falling apart under drone strikes, and the occupiers' losses are breaking records. The Black Sea, once considered the domain of the Russian fleet, is increasingly turning into a zone of constant fear for the Kremlin. And while Peskov talks about great successes, even in the US, they are now openly speaking about the exhaustion of Russia's offensive potential. So what is really happening at the front? Why has June become one of the most difficult months for Putin's army? And how is Ukraine step by step taking away Russia's main military advantages? Let's break it down right now. While Russian propaganda paints yet another picture of victory, the Ukrainian armed forces, quietly and without much noise, have caused a real collapse of the front for the occupiers. In one of the sectors, Ukrainian forces regained control over dozens of square kilometers of territory in just a month and a half, areas that had been considered Russia's rear for more than a year. And the most interesting thing is that the Russians are trying to hide such a painful failure at any cost. According to preliminary estimates, we're talking about at least 50 square kilometers of liberated land, and certain hints from analysts suggest that the numbers could be even higher. To put it in perspective, if this data is confirmed for the first time in a long while, Ukraine could have a positive balance of liberated territory in a single month. And this is already a serious signal to everyone who was quick to write off Ukraine's offensive potential. The enemy's reaction is especially telling. Throughout June, the Russian side published only a few videos from this direction, and even those actually showed not the occupiers' successes, but the advance of Ukrainian forces. When an army that usually films every meter of its movement suddenly goes silent, it often means only one thing: there's really nothing to show. It seems Ukrainian drones have turned part of the front into a real zone of terror for the occupiers. Russia was forced to bombard its own former positions with dozens of guided aerial bombs, trying to stop the advance of the Ukrainian armed forces. But even that didn't help. What was recently considered a Russian bridgehead is gradually coming under the control of Ukrainian forces. And there is another very important detail here. The offensive began with the use of armored vehicles, which, contrary to the predictions of many experts, are far from obsolete. Combined with the widespread use of drones, this allowed them to break through and minimize losses. In fact, Ukrainian forces are demonstrating a new formula for an offensive where drones not only assist the troops, but actually pave the way for them through the most dangerous sections of the front. And that's not all. In just 1 month, Ukraine's defense forces struck more than 200,000 enemy targets, and behind each of these numbers are destroyed equipment, demolished depots, burned supply routes, and yet another blow to Russia's ability to continue the war. The most painful outcome for the occupiers is that nearly 28,000 Russian soldiers were either eliminated or sustained such severe injuries that they were put out of action. In fact, June has become one of the most difficult months for the Russian army in recent times. And importantly, Ukrainian strikes are increasingly reaching the enemy far beyond the front line, in places where they recently still felt relatively safe. The Minister of Defense reported that the number of targets hit at a distance of more than 50 kilometers from the line of contact has almost doubled. In other words, Ukrainian drones and precision strike weapons are penetrating ever deeper into the Russian rear. And this means that for the occupiers, the war no longer ends beyond the first line of defense. Special emphasis is placed on logistics. It is logistics that is being hit the hardest today. It seems as if Ukrainian UAV operators have launched a real hunt for anything moving toward the front. Trucks, fuel tankers, motorcycles, ammunition depots, all of these are increasingly turning into smoke before they even reach Russian positions. June has become a record-breaking month for the defense forces. Ukrainian forces set a record for destroying Russian artillery, achieved their best result ever in intercepting enemy drones, nearly 50,000 units, and also broke the absolute record for destroying the occupiers' vehicles and motorcycles. And most importantly, these are no longer just isolated successful operations, but a systematic campaign to exhaust the enemy. Day after day, Ukrainian drones methodically tighten the noose around the occupiers' logistics. And it seems that this is exactly what Moscow fears most. After all, the front can be reinforced with new soldiers, but restoring a destroyed supply system under constant fire from Ukrainian drones is much more difficult. That is why June may turn out to be not just a record month of losses for Russia, but the beginning of much more serious problems ahead. And while the Ukrainian armed forces are reclaiming their land meter by meter, it seems that in the Kremlin they have decided to take their favorite approach and simply draw themselves a victory. After another series of successes by the Ukrainian military at the front, Putin's press secretary Dmitry Peskov suddenly started talking about major achievements by the Russian army and the inevitable fulfillment of all the war's objectives. However, there is one problem. Reality once again forgot to coordinate its plans with Kremlin propaganda. While Russians were being told on the radio about a successful offensive, independent analysts carefully studied the maps that Russian generals showed to Putin, and it turned out that there is a gap of almost 2,000 square kilometers between the front lines and the Kremlin's reports. In other words, while the Ukrainian armed forces are liberating territories in the real world, the Russian general staff compensates for this by capturing territories in a world of fantasy. The funniest part is not even the scale of these fabrications, but their content. On the paper maps prepared for Putin, the Russian army has supposedly almost reached Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, allegedly fully controls Chasiv Yar, is advancing toward Dobropilya, and in some places is nearly approaching Zaporizhia. It gives the impression that the Kremlin's master is being shown not military reports, but a trailer for yet another science fiction movie. This is exactly where it becomes clear why Moscow speaks so confidently about its successes. If you look at maps every day where the army advances faster than common sense, you can start to believe any fairy tale. The only problem is that the real front exists outside the Kremlin offices. And there, Russian troops are increasingly encountering not drawn arrows, but Ukrainian drones, artillery, and counterattacks. But the most painful blow for the Kremlin, it seems, happened not on land, but at sea. On Navy Day, Volodymyr Zelensky stated directly, Russia has lost the Black Sea. Just a few years ago, such a statement would have seemed like science fiction. A country without a large navy forced one of the world's largest naval fleets to retreat. After the liberation of Snake Island and a series of strikes on ships, headquarters, bases, and ports, the occupiers have effectively lost the ability to feel like masters of the waters. Today, the Black Sea has become yet another example of how Ukrainian technology and unconventional solutions are breaking Russian military patterns. Naval drones have accomplished what was considered almost impossible until recently. They forced the Russian Black Sea fleet to shift from a show of force to a mode of constant survival. And now Russian ships increasingly resemble not hunters, but prey, constantly looking over their shoulders. It seems this is only the beginning of much bigger problems for Moscow. After all, if the Black Sea is no longer safe for Russian ships, then the Black Sea and Azov regions can no longer be considered a rear area. And while the Kremlin continues to boast about its successes, Ukraine is step by step taking away from the enemy what it once considered its undeniable advantage. What do you think about the latest events? We look forward to your comments. There is more to come. Stay informed about the main events and don't forget to like. Wishing you peaceful skies above.